The apparent contradiction at the center of U.S. policy toward Iran is simple. President Donald Trump repeatedly presents himself as a leader who wants peace, opposes endless wars, and prioritizes economic prosperity over foreign military adventures. Yet his decision to launch military strikes against Iran pushed the Middle East toward one of its most dangerous confrontations in decades. At first glance, these two positions seem impossible to reconcile, but from a geopolitical perspective, they reflect a long-standing logic of great power statecraft. Leaders sometimes use force not because they want war, but because they believe limited war can produce a more favorable peace. The first point to understand is that the Trump administration did not view the Iran conflict as an isolated military operation. Washington viewed it as part of a broader strategy aimed at restoring deterrence. For years, American policymakers argued that Iran had steadily expanded its regional influence through proxy networks, missile programs, maritime disruption, and nuclear development. In this view, diplomacy alone was insufficient, because Tehran believed the United States lacked the political will to impose meaningful costs. Military action was therefore intended to alter Iranian calculations rather than achieve outright regime change. This reflects a classic balance of power approach. Throughout history, great powers have often used limited force to reinforce credibility. The objective is not necessarily territorial gain. It is to shape the behavior of rivals. From Washington's perspective, the strikes were designed to demonstrate that certain actions would trigger consequences. Whether this approach succeeds is another question, but the strategic logic is clear. The administration sought peace through coercion rather than peace through accommodation. The second factor involves alliance management. The United States remains deeply embedded in a regional security architecture that includes Israel and several Gulf partners. These states increasingly viewed Iran's growing capabilities as a direct threat to regional stability. In practice, American credibility is tied not only to its own security interests, but also to the confidence of its allies. If allies begin doubting Washington's willingness to act, they may pursue more independent and potentially destabilizing strategies. The decision to use force against Iran therefore carried implications far beyond the immediate battlefield. It was also a signal directed toward allies and adversaries alike. Yet this approach created a strategic dilemma. While military action may strengthen deterrence in the short term, it can also generate new risks. Iran demonstrated this reality through its ability to threaten maritime traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. Despite significant military asymmetry, Tehran retained leverage because of geography. The strait remains one of the world's most important energy choke points. By disrupting shipping and creating uncertainty in energy markets, Iran reminded the world that weaker powers can still impose substantial costs on stronger adversaries. This brings us to the broader implications for the Indo-Pacific. Although the conflict occurred in the Middle East, its consequences extend deep into Asia. The Indo-Pacific remains heavily dependent on Gulf energy supplies. Japan, South Korea, India, and many Southeast Asian economies rely on uninterrupted flows of oil and gas through the Strait of Hormuz. A prolonged disruption would affect energy prices, inflation, industrial production, and economic growth across the region. The conflict therefore demonstrated the continued interdependence of Middle Eastern and Indo-Pacific security. The crisis also carries implications for great power competition. Every major military commitment consumes resources, attention, and political capital. For the United States, a prolonged confrontation with Iran risks diverting strategic focus from the Indo-Pacific, where competition with China remains Washington's primary long-term challenge. This is one reason why Beijing closely monitors developments in the Gulf. China benefits from stable energy supplies, but it also understands that American involvement in multiple theaters can complicate U.S. force posture and strategic planning. At the same time, the conflict highlights the growing importance of economic security in modern geopolitics. The ability of Iran to influence global energy markets despite overwhelming American military superiority demonstrates that strategic power is no longer measured solely in tanks, aircraft, and warships. Economic choke points, supply chains, and maritime trade routes have become critical instruments of national influence. In this sense, the Strait of Hormuz occupies a role similar to that of the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. Each represents a strategic corridor whose stability affects the broader international system. Perhaps the most important lesson is that deterrence itself is evolving. Traditional deterrence focused on preventing military aggression through the threat of overwhelming force. Today's environment is more complex. States increasingly employ economic disruption, proxy warfare, cyber operations, and maritime coercion to achieve political objectives without crossing the threshold of full-scale war. The U.S. Iran confrontation illustrates this new reality. Neither side seeks total war, yet both continue to engage in forms of competition that generate instability. Looking ahead, the central question is whether the use of force against Iran will ultimately strengthen or weaken American strategic positioning. If the conflict succeeds in restoring deterrence and producing a durable diplomatic framework, Washington may argue that limited military action achieved its objective. If, however, the crisis becomes prolonged and repeatedly disrupts global energy markets, it could undermine American influence and distract from higher priority challenges elsewhere. For the Indo-Pacific, the lesson is clear. Events in the Middle East cannot be viewed as separate from Asian security. The global economy is increasingly interconnected, and strategic shocks in one region rapidly affect others. Trump's decision to use force against Iran may have been intended to create peace through strength. Whether it produces stability or further competition will shape not only the future of the Middle East, but also the wider balance of power across the Indo-Pacific.